And it's also got illustration, wonderful pictures of his old man. I don't know about the idea portion of it, although she's quite confident right about that. She lives in Cambridge. Worked away at this about 12, 15 years. The biography. You got it?
It's coming in the mail.
Coming in the mail. Wait, I haven't seen it yet myself. There are very few psychiatrists of which there's ever been a biography written. Occasionally they write autobiographies, some of which are quite good. Paul Myerson's father, Abraham Myerson, wrote a splendid book called Speaking of Man, which I recommend to you. Abraham Myerson was one of the great practitioners in Boston. Wonderful man, great twinkle in his eye, and a great shrewd natural psychologist. He was a professional colleague. They shared an office with Harry Solomon, who's the maker of this modern version of this hospital. There's a biography of Elmer Southard, which is our first chief. It's not very good. Of course, there are biographies of Freud. There's a little sketch of William Allenson White. There's no good biography of Adolf Meyer, which is a curiosity. There's a book about it, but it isn't a very good biography. But psychiatrists are something new in the world, so it's not too surprising. Well, this is the second talk I've given under the title of Giving Someone Freedom. And that title, which is a carryover from an earlier set of ideas I had and perhaps should be changed, is the subject of this is essentially the concept of goals or ends or ideals or health, the psychiatric concept of health. And I'll summarize what I said last time and I'll move along. These remarks fall under three successive headings. The first deals with the meaning of health in the disease school. That is, the meaning of health in the objective descriptive world. Then the psychoanalytic conception of health. And finally, my own suggestions as to a viable system of health. My basic contention can be very briefly summarized. It says this. It says that the objective descriptive school is remarkable in not having an idea about health. The analytic people are remarkable in having too strong an idea about health. And what we need is something that is workable without being essentially an ethical system, as psychoanalysis, I think, fundamentally is. I don't probably need to persuade you the importance of this subject, but it certainly is of vast importance, because if we don't know what health is, we really have a hell of a time deciding what disease is. And that's one of the troubles with the objective descriptive school, in my opinion. It's also true that it's of great importance to the psychotherapist, because your conception of health obviously has very important subliminal and whatever impact on your relationship with the patient, your whole judgment of the patient, if you like. So I don't think I need to persuade anybody about that we have to come to some kind of make up our mind of what we think psychological health is, if we're going to have a coherent view of our work. And this is an attempt to begin to sketch in something like that. It's obviously very preliminary, and I only get into it at all because this course of lectures is called Language and Mind and Psychotherapy. And I realized as I was going on that there was coming out of it a conception of both abnormal and normal mind. And I thought I should try to make that explicit. And then I realized when I thought harder about that what the limitations of the concept of health were in psychiatry, and so I got a little more interested. Now, let me repeat again what I want to say about the disease school, which is today the dominant thing in American psychiatry and world psychiatry. It's always been the dominant thing in world psychiatry, outside of Russia, where it's replaced by the Pavlovian system. is an interesting system too. The disease school, of course, claims that psychological phenomena can be ordered into symptoms and signs, and these in turn group into syndromes, and that there is at least a hope of diseases. And by disease, of course, they mean predictable relationships between cause, clinical picture, course, and outcome. And as those things get established, of course, further predictable relationships between those and also things like epidemiology, pathogenesis, treatment, blah, blah, blah. Now, this is a very strong hope. It remains, of course, a very fragile hope, because we know there are very few conditions where we have any confidence at all that we have a relationship between cause, particularly, and anything else in psychiatry, because we don't, for the most part, have any ideas about cause in psychiatry. And, it's always, to me, a source of great amusement that the only syndrome in psychiatry, that, to my knowledge, that has ever been predicted from childhood phenomena is psychopathy, sociopathy. The most recent of all psychiatric syndromes to enter our field, and also the one about which we're most pessimistic and least psychologically interested. And yet it's the only one in which there are reasonably convincing prospective predictive studies on which kids get psychopathy and which don't. And of course, those also ironically come from the Harvard Law School. That's appropriate. But anyway, there is this conception that psychiatric phenomena can be ordered into disease. And it's a very powerful idea. It's one that, although terribly limited, gains periodic popularity, as right now. And it, of course, is one of the most promising ideas in all of our work. Now, the thing about it that I want to emphasize is something that I'd be very interested in seeing whether you agree with me about. My contention is that in psychiatry, the disease conception is different than in physical medicine, and that the difference is a very important one. And the difference is that in psychiatry, there is only a negative conception of health in the disease school. That, of course, is not the case at all in physical medicine. Everything you do in physical medicine is predicated upon even numerically determinable indexes of health. And disease is not only to be defined as a syndrome, but it also is measurable in terms of its departure from measurements of functional capacity, whether in the EEG or the respiratory system or anywhere else, visual acuity, blood pressure, pulse. All these are as much signs of life as they are signs of disease. Another way of saying that is that the psychiatrist, the physician pronounces someone dead on the basis of the expiration of signs of life. And we take all that for granted. Now, it's my contention that that is not the way that psychiatric diseases are diagnosed. Or, in other words, that we have really no measurement of health against which these are regularly positive. Now, that's not entirely true, of course, because if you think of the principal way by which we, as descriptive psychiatrists, make our observations, you are thinking, of course, about the mental status examination, psychological examination. And in that, there are some measures of health. But I think it's diagnostic of the system itself that the measures of health that are strongest in the psychological examination are concerned functions like memory, calculation, types of thinking, etc. It's another way of saying it is that those are the parts of the psychological examination that are most interested to neurologists. Indeed, they're most highly developed by neurologists. And they are in part a carryover of the how wonderful. She might never find it. Are there things my wife has never found at the bottom of her? That is a metaphor for what men think about the insides of women's heads. You know that? You mustn't play on that. What my wife does is turn it upside down. Maybe it isn't even in there. It's a ventriloquist.
I'm sorry, I really
Oh,
prefer.
wonderful. That's great. Whenever I have a sort of fun time with nothing to do, I've been writing notes about a book I'm going to write called Scenes from the Birth of the New Society. And I've got a whole bunch of them. Scenes from the Birth of. I thought that's such a wonderful title. I got it from a German internist with a wonderful name of von Weizsäcker, a real person. And he was sort of an existential type. And he made some observations, and he sort of called them that. He never wrote a book about it. Scenes from the Birth of the New Society. One of my favorites is a transcript I have of a man when I was referee for the Social Security Administration many years ago, trying to decide who should get what was called permanently and totally disabled. People would come in who would display enormous ingenuity and intelligence, proving they were permanently disabled. It's an interesting phenomenon. It only comes up where you have a society which protects the handicapped. But in other words, the more clever, persistent, courageous, etc. you are, the more likely you might be to get this curious thing. And I have a transcript of an interview in which someone proves this. They're permanently disabled. A lot of scenes like that. No, I'm getting off the singing, but this should be another one. That would be unfair. Anyway, so that I'm contending that this mental status examination is strongest where it's essentially neurological, where it concerns the state of consciousness, the measurement of intelligence, where it's of most interest to retardation people and also to neurologists. And, to come to the point, the mental status examination is largely helpless where it comes to those things which interest us. Things like coping behavior, capacity for affection, imaginative strength, various things which really shape our work from the start. So that's my reason for contending that there's almost nothing in it that talks to a psychiatric vision of health. If you take something, look at the section on affects. What do you do in the mental status examination with affect? You try to find out what affects the patient has. That's an interesting kind of notion. It begins to approach the notion of a person's affective capacity, doesn't it? But it by no means gets there, because affective capacity is somewhat different than the affects you at that moment particularly have. And if you were to design, as we might begin to plan to do, a method by which you could determine someone's affective capacity, that would be very different from the mental status examination that is presently constituted. Well, look, I'll come back around to that. Anyway, but that's my contention. That I shouldn't say that there are no measures of health in the mental status examination, but they are very poor, they are very few, they are very ineffective. And when you put that against the measures of health in the physical examination, and in the general tools of physical medicine, you see that we really are not giving an account, and that our syndromes, in a sense, sit in a vacuum in which it is not possible to describe by anything more than what is presented by the patient that looks sick, as opposed to any kind of picture of how it diverges from what is health, which is so fundamental in general medicine. Well, I won't belabor that, and perhaps it's not convincing, but at least it seems to me that the data points in that direction. Anyway. Then I ask myself the question, why is it that that hasn't been called attention to if it's true? It might be false it would be called attention to, although many false things are called attention to, of course. Anyway, there are two reasons I think that it might not be called attention to. One is that the people most wedded to the disease idea in psychiatry are themselves also most wedded to biology. And therefore they may sneak in to psychiatry their assumptions about normal biological function to buttress up the absence of psychological function. And one of my ways of saying that, you've heard me say ad nauseum before, that is that it's a mistake to assume that because the patient's body is in the room, that his mind is. But on the whole, people educated in the descriptive school assume that because the patient's body is in his room, his mind is there. Often a fatal assumption. I think there's another reason, too, that this failure in our sort of theoretical psychiatry hasn't been more evident, is that there is there is a whole series of contentions about health which have been brought into psychiatry through psychoanalysis. And then I think that the combination of sort of biological prejudices in the descriptive psychiatrists and the fact that the Freudian system, as it developed very strong ideas about the notions of health. Those two things, I think, have really kept us from realizing some of the difficulties of our conceptions of health. Well, now my second topic is the psychoanalytic concept of health. And I have chosen someone I think is a little bit of a sitting duck. But since he's such a large and beautiful and widely respected duck, and since he's a duck that's almost never criticized, much less cooked, I wanted to work away at him a little bit, i.e. Erik Erikson. And I want to suggest to you, in a nutshell, that Erikson's system is an ethical system. Indeed, I think it's one of the most impressive ethical systems outside the great religions. And I want to see if I can interest you in that idea. And of course, that's my point, isn't it? That instead of being a medical system, it's an ethical system. And we really don't have much to do, we shouldn't have much to do with ethical systems. We leave those to the priests and the lawyers. And I could turn this whole discussion upside down and say, well, yes, Thomas Szasz is right. And that we are trying to impose things on people of a cultural nature. I'm going to argue though, that Thomas Szasz is wrong, because there's a way of looking at this that isn't necessarily impositional. Well, let me see if I can interest you in an attack on that high priest. Now, the overarching idea of Erikson's system is the notion of the life cycle. And of course, what he did, and his remarkable feat, was to extend the developmental ideas of Freud and Abraham into adult life, into old age even. And then, of course, to extend and test those ideas against different societies, cultures, biography, history, etc. It's a monumental kind of process. Now, therefore, since we have this elaborate conception of the life cycle, my question is, what is it? Is it a biological idea? Is it an ethical idea? Is it a sociological idea? Is it a guide? Is it what is called a way? Or is it an unfolding, like embryological unfolding? What is it? Now, you don't have to read very long in Erikson for him to tell you what it is. And I'll give you some quotations. I think it's clear, though, that his answer is not clear, or it's almost clear. But for a while it's very clear, and then you see the muddiness in it. But it doesn't take forever. Here are two passages. These are from fairly recent things by Erikson. I'll read this slowly. As I now quote, this is Erikson, as I now quote what the embryologist has to tell us about the epigenesis of organ systems, I hope the reader will hear the probability that all growth and development follows analogous patterns. Now that's not chilling enough. Let me take this one. To us, it is first of all important to realize that in the sequence of significant experiences, the healthy child, if properly guided, can be trusted to conform to the epigenetic laws of development, as they now create a succession of potentialities for significant interaction with a growing number of individuals and with the mores that govern them. Let me just, well, it's a lot of words, but the first part is the important one. It is first of all to realize that in the sequence of significant experiences, the healthy child, if properly guided, can be trusted to conform to the epigenetic laws of development. Well, what does that sound like?
Sounds like dogma.
Sounds a lot like. In this same paper, by the way, it's given us a very large chart, even more detailed than the ones that you're familiar with, for example, from Childhood and Society, which has stages, modes, crises, strengths, antipathies, principles of social order, binding ritualizations, ritualisms, at each stage of life. Now, Erikson is contending, and there are lots of other quotations that I could give you that would say the same two sets of things. But the life cycle unfolds. That all growth and development is analogous to embryological development. And the healthy child will conform to these developmental laws if properly guided. Furthermore, he contends that this is a single line of development. Now, I said that this was almost clear. The phrase, if properly guided, signals why it is not altogether clear. Without that phrase, the life cycle is presented as an extension of embryology, as a process independent of choice or volition. With that phrase, of course, ethics and choice obviously enter. Now, I want to make a second argument. And that is that the attractiveness of the life cycle idea, and I don't think there's any of us that aren't attracted to it. I think if there's something we almost take for granted must be true, it's that. I will argue that the attractiveness idea springs from three metaphors: the embryological metaphor, the evolutionary metaphor, and the metaphor of the so-called great chain of being. And I'll work backwards. Now, the idea of the great chain of being is what Arthur Lovejoy calls one of the half-dozen most potent and persistent presuppositions in all Western thought. And here's a quotation from that wonderful book, which I also recommend to you if you don't know it, The Great Chain of Being by Arthur Lovejoy, which is scholarship at its greatest, seems to me. This is the definition of the great chain of being. The conception of the plan and structure of the world, which through the Middle Ages and down to the late 18th century, many philosophers, most men of science, and indeed most educated men, were to accept without question the conception of the universe as a great chain of being composed of an immense number of links ranging in hierarchical order from the meagerest kinds of existence through every possible grade up to the ens perfectissimus. Ens perfectissimum. Guess I haven't reached perfectissimum. You were tortured with Alexander Pope when you were in school, but I wasn't. Here's Alexander Pope's account of the great chain of being. Vast chain of being which from God began, nature's ethereal, human, angel, man, beast, bird, insect, fish, what no eye can see, no glass can reach, from infinite to thee, from thee to nothing, on superior powers. Were we to press, inferior might be ours, or in the full creation leave a void. Where one step broken, one fixation point, one step broken, the great scales destroyed. From nature's chain, whatever link you strike, 10th or 10,000th breaks the chain alike. You see the analytic view of fixation and regression. Now, I think that's the background for what sets us up to believe in something like the life cycle. But now that is by no means the only thing. And when you think of the embryological parallel and the evolutionary parallel, you can see why this idea has such a total grip on our minds. Now, the popular conception of evolution derives in part, I believe, from this great chain of being. The popular conception of evolution, you remember, is the idea that there is a single path from low, squirmy creatures in the sea, right, up through more and more complex organisms, reaching not the ens perfectissimum now, but man, capital M, woman, small w. That is the great chain of evolutionary being. Now that's the popular conception of evolution, and you'll see it on the television. You see it even in some of the primitive textbooks. And we know that is not the conception of evolution at all. That's what I call, that's a symptom, that's a compromise formation. It's a compromise between the actual idea of evolution and the idea of a single man-centered myth. Now, we all know that the real conception of evolution is not of a single great chain of being, but a great many chains of being, with only the most arbitrary way of deciding which is the best. If you were watching Channel 2 last night, and you can watch any program any night, they're all about dinosaurs. And there was a great one about dinosaurs and reptiles. And it started out the way these things so often do about dinosaurs now, by the announcement that the dinosaur is, of course,
extraordinary creature, if only because it was on Earth for 180 million years. Now, there are some turtles that have been on longer, and alligators and crocodiles that, were there from the beginning and are still with us. But that's a very impressive pitching record. 180 million years. And what is it that makes that possible? Well, they don't know. They have various interesting theories. And one of them is that the reptiles have a very serious advantage over us because a reptile can exist on about, it's estimated, 10% of the energy or food requirements a week. And that's because they don't put so darn much work into maintaining their temperatures, but instead have developed other means of it. That, of course, was their Achilles heel, some people believe. Some people think they were wiped out by a meteorite. Other people think there was a change in climate that was so great as to destroy possibly their existence. But that's a theory. But in any case, 180 million years isn't long, isn't it?
Hi. You have to grab the other food.
He sure is. He's very eager to come. Now you say, well, that's just longevity. We have Shakespeare. That's an argument that everybody makes. But as you get older, you'll have more respect for longevity. And when you think about things like Southern senators and bureaucrats, where longevity is the purpose, which are very complex forms of humanism, right? I don't think you should underestimate the complexity and sophistication that goes into longevity. And do read about some of the theories of why the dinosaurs have the form they have, if you don't think it's a very sophisticated and complicated achievement. Well, put that aside. Anyway, there's no question that the real concept of evolution does not consist of a single chain of being. That's I want to separate it out from the appeal of the evolutionary metaphor. Now, what about the embryological metaphor? That one is, he says it himself. He wants us to hear embryology as we think about growth and development. Well, the issue is, does growth and development after the evolution of the embryo, right, does it continue that way? Does it follow unfoldings of neural crests and all the rest of it per in utero? Well, we don't know. It may well do such things. All I'm saying is that one mustn't suppose that it does. But there's one very, very important difference, and this is what I want to highlight, between the embryological development and the life cycle. And I think it's perfectly plain once you think about it. In embryology, you can confirm the embryological process, as we all did to some extent, of course, in embryology in college, by various experimental procedures, which you can repeat 1,000 times, and which produce not invariably, at least in my hands, the same result, enough consistency so that you have some real sense of an inherent process unfolding. But the life cycle, once it is announced, once it is advertised, once it is seen as a path, itself has enormous influences on what people conceive of the life cycle should be. It becomes then not simply a reflection of a process that goes on independently, but itself one of the important shapers of what you should do with your life. And psychotherapy, of course, offers itself as a wonderful example of that same thing, as we guide as well as listen. And our conception about what a person should be doing next, or what's excusable because you're in midlife crisis, etc., shapes very much the very phenomena that it studies. That's the reason I say that I don't know of any way to tell whether the life cycle is a biological system or an ethical system. Well, that's my second. Now, if it is an ethical system, that's nothing to make fun of, is it? Ethical systems are very, very important. And I think Erickson's can be defended as one of the most interesting ones that you can encounter. I think it can be defended as one of the most interesting ethical systems we have. Not only is it a very detailed system, but I think when you look at parts of it, you see that it really is able both to strike a balance between and also to deepen our grasp of all kinds of ancient and modern dilemmas. I mean, the dilemma of society versus solitude as goals in life, of selfishness versus altruism, of independence versus passivity, various issues that he addresses very directly, and which he, is always illuminating. Furthermore, it may be, I'm no student of religion, so this may be all west, but it certainly is a competitor in terms of the way in which it relates itself to different times of life, because it does that primarily, and also the way in which it relates itself to bodily life. So it has, if it is an ethical system, it certainly has very impressive credentials. And in my opinion, such impressive credentials, what doesn't need to be buttressed by embryological and evolutionary metaphors. Well, because whether it's intended as an ethical system, whether it really is an ethical system or not, the fact is it operates as an ethical system in the actual world of psychotherapy. That I will contend. And because of that, I think it's unsuitable. It's unsuitable as a definition of human health. And now let me, David?
It isn't clear to me that he hasn't proclaimed himself as an ethical system. I have to go a roundabout way here, but for example, he says properly guided. Now, the embryological unfolding is also properly guided by being held in a constant milieu or one which is controlled according to, must be admitted, to some sort of genetic program. But nonetheless, quite carefully guided and fairly standard from one person to the next, so that it's not very surprising.
At least if you survive, right?
Yeah. It's not that surprising that people come out looking pretty similar to one another.
Right. So they are the embryological environment becomes the social environment.
When you pop out and you're subject to many vagaries and vicissitudes of the environment that no longer have such tight control, it's not very surprising that people cease being quite so similar to one another. But it doesn't mean that an inborn programmed unfolding
Isn't still occurring.
encountering
Or that the sociological world doesn't follow the same rules.
Right. So we're all agreed on that.
David, I'm not saying it isn't an embryological system.
I thought you were, but that's...
I'm saying we can't tell what it is.
Okay. But then when he says properly, so we agree that things are guided, but properly is the ethical. Properly is where the observation that there's a conflict of motives involved becomes a normative statement as to how that conflict should be guided. So I think when he says properly, he's announcing he's dealing with ethics and not...
Certainly, I think he was giving away without perhaps even reflecting on it, what he meant.
Now that word is a
Yeah. Well, but he might retreat into what David says. That it's a proper environment. The pH is held standard or something. Right? He might say that.
So the womb is an ethical environment.
Yeah. It's a proper environment, certainly. The proper environment for the embryo. Eh?
Another model that I think might bear along with the genetic idea, at least in the cognitive realm, is Piaget studies. It seems that there is kind of a flow.
Right.
That unless something improper takes place, you're going to go through this thing all the way on through.
Right.
I'm not sure that I think that Piaget probably has better studies to substantiate his model.
Yeah, well, he has a sort of quasi-experimental procedure, then. Right.
I was wondering what could be done in a similar vein for Ericksonian genetic model, as far as studies to either support it as more than just an ethical, but actually
Well, that's been attempted, right, by George Vaillant, empirical evidence for...
But don't you see, this is a circular system. You can't prove it because you don't know to what extent the ethics may not be operating just as powerfully as your embryological factors. And it's true that the world religions have a lot in common too. Do you see religion as fundamentally an embryological phenomenon? Well, you might.
That day may be coming. But for the present, we still make those distinctions.
The catch would be that various studies are correlational, and there would be an experimental study. We have to do what we consider to be unethical, which is private people in society. So that it's untestable within our ethical system.
And even
Probably didn't.
Well, there are many experiments of nature.
Even Piaget's conceptual schema has not really been borne out to be true at all stages. Like not everybody reaches the stage of formal operation. And if you went out and tested everybody in society, you'd find that can't do formal.
The argument would be that they didn't have the proper environment. They would have formed, now.
Yeah, but who's to say which is proper?
Well, but that's it. Well, that's the point. But don't think that if you could prove that indeed people did follow Erickson's path, that would not make it embryological necessarily. They might simply all be victims of the same kind of cultural or ethical ideas. You don't. Your point, though, is a very good one in terms of psychotherapy, because at best it's a mass phenomenon. And therefore and it contains no standard deviations. None. So you have no way of knowing where the patient is in that system until you have standard deviations, right?
Take, for example, a child who's raised by wolves.
You mean that literally or figuratively?
Literally.
Literally.
That the child might be properly guided according to what wolves normally teach their kind.
Mm-hmm.
And then, I mean, it's really, if you take that as an example, that would be in support of a multiplicity of evolutionary kinds of ways that people grow through their lives, and the kinds of conflicts that a person might experience, stages or passages that a person has to go through as the child of a wolf might be different.
Might be very. You don't even have to take it a way out type example. Yours is the most famous one. Your example you have is the French. What's the Auvergne boy?
Yeah.
Auberge, whatever it is. But take a figure like Rousseau, who attempted to affect the way in which children were brought up. It had a very large impact on education in France. Now, how do you look upon that kind of influence? Is that a disordering of the proper sequence? Is it the introduction of obviously fresh ethical and social influences, right?
Well, Romulus and Remus still invented civilization, even though they were raised by a wolf.
Who is this? Point. Gosh. Well, I as I say, I don't know what this is, but I do think that there's no way of not deciding what it is presently in existence, and that I do feel I know that whatever it may really be, it operates as an ethical system, as a set of ideas. And again, I don't mean to attack those ideals. They're certainly noble, and one of the things that is most wonderful about Erickson is that he sort of looks like it's sort of an autobiography of him. You know him, and I gave a talk about him once when he was there, and my talk was mostly critical, but I wanted to express my great respect for him, so I closed with that. I don't know whether you know that wonderful passage from Kierkegaard, which he says, most thinkers are like people who build a great castle and then live in a little hut beside it. And that can't be, Kierkegaard says, because if you do not live in the thing you build, that immediately turns it upside down. And so I said that I thought one of the great things about Erickson was that he really lived in the castle he built. In fact, he sort of was the castle he built. And I think that's the reason he's the sort of culture hero that he genuinely is in our world. Nevertheless, this is a set of, in action, whatever else it may be, is a set of ethical ideals. Now, my final section concerns, which I haven't developed very well, but let me give you the ideas I have about it. It essentially rests on the idea that you do need some sense of health
but that an ethical system is not suitable in a medical and psychotherapeutic environment as a set of ideals. And the reason for that is that we do not have to do with prescribing behavior. Essentially, we have to do with the health, that is, ensuring function. And that the doctor's attitude is quintessentially relative indifference to what you do with your health, but intense interest in what the state of your health is. I don't know whether you ever bumped into it. When I was a little boy, I remember there was waging a great debate at one point as to what to think of the physician, who was a surgeon, a would-be surgeon, who in 1863 put a splint on John Wilkes Booth's broken leg. I don't know where they teach in England about why John Wilkes Booth had a broken leg, but he did it because he jumped from the balcony of the theater after murdering Abraham Lincoln and landed on the stage crying, "Sic semper tyrannis," which is the motto of Vermont, and in the process broke his leg. And then he went hobbling off and escaped in the hubbub. Well, he showed up, I believe, in Virginia at one point. A physician who may have recognized it, it's unclear, treated his leg. But, well, that was a great moral debate in the days before we had real debates about ethics in medicine. And that was, should the physician have treated John Wilkes Booth, the murderer of the great emancipator? Well, maybe I was influenced, like we all are, too much by my youth, but I thought that was a great debate, and I thought the way it came out, at least in the version that I encountered, was even greater, which was that yes, he should have. And for Christ's sake, the South had been trying to murder the North for 4 years, and the North the South said, what the hell difference does this make? And the medic went in among, right, the dying and the crying and tried to help. And we somehow stood apart from all these political nutheads and their fanatic attitudes to what was right and wrong. And if you throw in the religious nutheads, who probably caused as many wars as the political nutheads, I thought we were in great shape, and there's reason enough to stand 4 years of medical school. Well, that's sort of the way I felt about it. So you can see what the background I come to this issue of ethics, politics, and the rest. And that's quite apart from any influence that Thomas has with his terrible concern about the use of ideals in order to imprison people, whether in the Soviet Union or in our country, whether you're interested in his ideas or not. Maybe it wouldn't be so easy to put somebody away because of their delusions if you also had to have some kind of test of their health. It certainly would be a lot more difficult to do that, at least in some places, wouldn't it? Especially because your delusions may be my truth, right? Or vice versa. So I wanted to try to begin to think about the mind as perhaps having certain functions which we could test for the functional capacity of, the way we test for the functional capacity of the lung or whatever. And so that if I had my way and I had the ingenuity to do it, maybe you, if you were interested in this, maybe you'd do it. We'd devise a mental status examination or some other set of tools which would enable us to talk about how the mind was doing. And that would give us a working test of health. In other words, we're going to define psychological health in terms of what the mind can do. Now, this is already something known to us. I already spoke about neurology, but that's the way retardation is in part defined, by what the mind can do. And I want to extend that principle, if you like, to general mental function.
There's a debate as to whether or not health should be described in terms of function, as opposed to what, when you say how is the mind doing, it's a different question. What can, well, maybe it's not a different question than what can the mind do, but it was certainly a different question than what is the mind doing. Someone might have the capacity to be in the room, but might choose to be out.
That's right. But that would be very important to determine, because you might have the capacity to breathe deeply, But if you as a physician examining the patient weren't able to get the patient to inhale, the results of your vital capacity test wouldn't be worth a damn. And that's part of our system, isn't it? That we think we have ways to get the patient to cooperate. If not, we better not pay much attention to our results. But my point is that, is that we're not concerned with what the patient says with his vital capacity, right? We're only concerned with his vital capacity. If he goes out afterwards, and says some outrageous thing to the world, that is not a medical problem, I don't think. In fact, it might be the best thing that happened. Anyway, so I'm going to take a swipe, and it's hardly more than a swipe, at defining what the mind should be able to do. And that I haven't had a great many different sort of dimensions to my picture of mind, so you'll hear familiar ones. I'm going to talk about imagination, closeness, and distance, as usual. So I think that let's just take up the first. Imagination. What can the normal mind do in the way of imagining? Well, you can think of two extremes, can't you? You can see minds that imagine too much and get carried away by their imagining and can't not imagine, i.e. can't be real. Huh? That's common in mania, for example. And then you see an opposite incapacity in the imaginary faculty, the capacity not to be able to imagine anything, not to be able to imagine the future, not to be able to imagine the past. We've talked about some of those failures. So that my test of health would have a lot of interest in the imaginative capacity. My second test would have a lot of interest in the capacity for closeness, what the existentialists call affective resonance, the capacity to be with somebody, the capacity to understand another person, to relate to them, as we say. It should tell us a great deal about that. Furthermore, it should also have a great deal to do with the opposite, the capacity to distance yourself from people and protect yourself from people, which is just as important as the capacity to get close to them. And it should be able to examine the capacity for self-protection and distance in a very systematic and thoroughgoing way. I never, before I began to think this way, I never realized why it was that I always felt good when patients didn't answer some questions. And I realized from many years of work in this building that our patients answer far too many questions despite your complaints. Sensible people, when you examine them, very often look at you and say, no, don't tell people those things. Huh? And we have, and I believe that's one of the reasons many of our patients are in the hospital, we have a group of people who answer any question, to do anything they're told. We've talked earlier about automatic obedience. So that without the kind of thing I'm talking about, we as therapists and physicians often fall victim to thinking that if the patient cooperates, that means they're healthy. When in fact it may be the clearest sign of the profundity of their sickness. Well, that's as good an example I've been able to think of so far of why you need a view of health and not simply a view of negation. Well, let's put this. Since we're in the same building with old Georgie and the defenses, let's think about the defenses for a minute. I would argue that denial and projection are fundamentally necessary properties of the human mind, and that indeed they are among some of the greatest achievements of the human mind. For example, the capacity not to be upset by something, to be able to go on despite the fact you have some ghastly thing next door to you, is in our business preeminently necessary. We have to be able to deny the significance of something, at least temporarily. And in the Anglo-Saxon countries, it is said that a stiff upper lip is one of the highest signs of civilized behavior. In other countries, Mediterranean countries perhaps, this is regarded as a sign of stiffness, incapacity, emotional shallowness, etc. Whatever the truth may be, one of the reasons, I think, that in particularly the exploratory countries in the colder regions of the world, why such a value would be given such a high place, was it really was necessary to endure absolutely unendurable situations and pretend they didn't exist. And the British were the most successful of anybody in creating a world empire, in part because they did. practice denial to an extent never realized perhaps in human history before. My favorite example is the British colonial administration sitting around in the middle of darkest Africa with their dinner clothes on. And when I was growing up, this was regarded as a sign of springing civilization to the Africa. In fact, it's absolute madness and nonsense and a source of immense discomfort and unnecessary expense. But nevertheless, it represents obvious, almost by ordinary terms, psychotic denial. They are not in the middle of Africa, where everybody with an ounce of sense is wearing some, sheet, right? They think they are still in Nottingham, huh? And they're having dinner in their evening clothes. Well, there are many other illustrations
But
of
that's not.
the value of denial.
But is that real denial, or is that?
We're going to come back. Hold that. I want to just expand on this. Let me humor me a little. Now let's take projection. I think projection an even stronger case can be made for the importance of projection. I believe that our work depends upon our projective capacity, our capacity to put our minds into the minds of other people, to really, in a sense, enslave ourselves to those minds for brief periods at least. And when you think about the place of projection and artistic creation, you really realize that you have someone who must be capable of an immense degree of loss of ego boundaries in the course of their work.
Low beat is a singer who can
Low, right, lost.
well,
Now, I'm sure you've heard from me, or you know independently, that the great story about James Joyce's daughter, that when he took this poor, wacky girl to everybody in Europe and finally ended up with Carl Jung. And Carl Jung said, yes, of course, Jimmy, she has dementia precox catenoides, catatonic schizophrenia, and Joyce went into his usual tirade to the effect that how, in God's name, could he, who was the greatest writer of English in the history of the world, be insulted this way because this girl, my daughter, talks just the way I write. To which point Carl Jung, brilliantly in my opinion, responded, she falls and you dive. Regression in the service of the ego, or whatever you want to call it. But in fact, if you dive the way I dive, you realize that there is no clear line between a fall and a dive. And if you look at falls, they always end up a little bit like a dive. So that we're not talking about something which can be sharply separated at any time. Nevertheless, that allows us in, doesn't it? Because it allows us to say that it is the capacity to ameliorate your dives or your denials, right? That indicates health. But now notice what's happened. We've transformed the test of health from the presence of a mental mechanism to our capacity to turn on and off, or to modify its usage, or indeed to deepen its usage. And that is something which we very seldom test for. That's what I'm getting to the point. That we assume that because a person is doing something, they have to do it, or that they can't do anything else. And that, God knows, is often enough true. But it's not an assumption that we can make, particularly if we believe that the important thing is the capacity to turn on and off, not the evidence of the denial or the projection itself.
Yeah. Well, there's a sticky place in the discussion here because, in a sense, we do that when we say the patient is behaving appropriately, this affect is appropriate. So we assume that he has some capacity to modulate it, and he knows that under this circumstance, this is the way you're supposed to manifest. It sounds suspiciously like a normative statement to say it's appropriate, but in a sense, for it to be appropriate, we assume that it's under the patient's control and he has some capacity to do it. So it really just is a matter of focus, whether you focus on the normative side of the idea or on the volitional side of the idea of appropriateness, as to whether you're dealing with ethics or with mental capacity of some sort.
Well, now that's a very telling point, and you're attacking the center of my system here, because insofar as you determine appropriateness, you determine something like health capacity. But I would contend very strongly that
that the amount of attention given to a real determination of appropriateness is minimal. And that for the most part you do not know whether it is appropriate or not. And there's a lot of reasons for that. The most blatant in this kind of community is the assumption that a patient's fantasies are delusions, and that therefore they're inappropriate. But one can go on at considerable length. And I don't mean that we don't make some brief pass at it, but in terms of any real testing of the imaginative capacity that delusion formation represents, for example, obviously I have a long way to making this before I make this persuasive, but do what I often do when you're talking to a deluded patient. See if you can find out to what extent they're playful, to what extent they really believe those things, to what extent they're kidding you. Go even further, and we come back to something we've talked at length about before, and see if you can figure out whether they're lying or not, whether they really believe it, or whether they've simply have realized that the best way to get in out of a cold Massachusetts winter is to tell somebody that God is talking to you. And if that doesn't work, if there's no beds in the hospital, you've got a really canny resident on duty, simply tell the resident that God told you to shoot yourself, and that'll do it. Right? See if you can you say that's an inappropriate idea. Well, maybe it is, maybe it's not. But see if you can play on the extent to which that idea is believed, to what extent it is a free imaginative production or a manipulative imaginative production, or to what extent it is something to which the person is stuck on. And I think you can find that's a very difficult thing to do. And it can be done, but it's a toughie.
Isn't that the kind of the difference between a fall and a dive? I think that there is something that distinguishes fall from a dive very distinctly, and that's the element of volition involved.
Or intentionality.
And that's the problem I'm having with the use of denial, or modulated denial. I mean, your use of that as the same process as the denial that we're taught about.
No, David, I'm not saying that they're the same process. One is intentional and unintentional. I'm just saying that it's very hard to tell.
But to the extent that it's intentional, it's not denial, right? To the extent that the guys in the middle of Africa are dressed up in dinner costumes, and they know they're in the middle of Africa, but they still want to dress that way, that's not denial. That is something else.
Well, it's a cultural pattern. Do they make that decision themselves, or is that just received wisdom? I think you get into a very difficult area. Maybe that's not a good example, Mary.
You're saying that you choose an offense, that it's not an offense.
If you choose not to think about the right, okay, in the technical sense.
But I want, I agree. I basically agree with what you're saying. But I say that in clinical practice, that's a very hard distinction to make. And what I'm saying is that that's where you should. That's what health is about: the intentionality, not the impulse. That's why I'm trying to shift it from the defense to the intentionality, if you like, or purposeness.
Much harder problem. Maybe that's why there's.
Well, that's also, you know, the idea is of what the complex of in the word association test, that when you would tell somebody a word, that there would be this long pause, somehow the word entered into their mind and was caught up in this complex, and therefore they didn't respond within a prescribed period of time, and you could therefore identify things that the person was stuck on. And that's not different, really, than, or it seems similar to what you're talking about, as to whether or not a person's is able to freely move their imagination about, or whether at times it gets stuck on them.
One problem that I see is that definition of health is quite limited. End up with the medical definition of health being normative across the whole population. It's a large group of people. The definition that you're suggesting, which is fascinating, and I think it's probably, to me, makes a lot of sense, but it's limited. Just how many people will it apply to? How many people can fit within it?
How many people will pass the test? Well, that doesn't bother us in medicine. You don't have a perfect vital capacity, right? I mean, if you're like me, you hardly have any at all. But
it, an ideal?
It becomes an ideal. And we always, in medicine, we always fool around with that. I used to think that when my pulse was 72, it was normal. Well, not by the standards of Rogers, say, or of any long-distance runner. So that I don't expect anybody to pass, so to speak, or not many people to pass. No? But I think you want to do a little movement in that area to see how the person is doing. No? Or am I not meeting you?
No, I think so. But, it asks a lot.
Well, we should ask a lot, shouldn't we? I mean, especially when we're trying to decide whether people are crazy or not. That's such a very important thing we do. And of course also psychotherapy. And I think these are three: imaginativeness, closeness, and distance. I would think that that's only a very first lick in the promise.
The question I have is that you get stuck again on moral values when you decide what the cutoff points are.
Yeah.
How much closeness, how much imaginativeness, how much distance.
Mm-hmm.
Do you cross the line between someone who we should treat versus someone who shouldn't?
That's right. That's right. I'm not so concerned with who you should treat as who you shouldn't, in the sense of people that are really doing much better than have been trapped in a system that hasn't enabled us to see them for what they really are. But I agree, that's escaping that. And I offer it not so humbly, largely because show me something else. And, in a treeless world, a honeysuckle bush looks good. And that's the state of things, I think. Mm-hmm. I'll see you next week. See you next week. See you next week. See you next